So it's great to be able to talk to you all tonight. Again, I'm Chad Hanson. I'm a research ecologist with the Muir project and on the national board of the Sierra Club. My wife Rachel and I live in Big Bear City, actually a couple miles east of Baldwin Lake, and have for the last 6 years. Before that, we were in the northern Sierra Nevada. And so, for background, I have a PhD in ecology. I do research on forest and fire ecology. I research fire history, different wildlife species that depend on post-fire habitat. And this is kind of the work I do. So I spend my time in fire areas, looking at a lot of the questions that come up in these areas. And really, fundamentally what I'm looking at is this one key question, is do fires destroy our forests? And that's really the question. It's a very, very common assumption that's out there in our society, and it's driving a lot of the management we're seeing, a lot of very bad forest management practices we're seeing. And so I researched that question, and what I'm finding is, and what my colleagues are finding, is that the answers are often very, very different from what we expect. Next slide, please. So,
okay, I gotta figure out how to do this one too. There we go. Is this the next one?
we all have a notion from decades of very well-funded public campaigns, Smokey the Bear, etc., is telling us that a healthy forest is a forest that's kind of a sea of live green trees. And obviously live green trees are very important in a forest. But it turns out that there's a lot more to a forest that it needs to be healthy ecologically. Next slide, please. This is a classic low-intensity fire area. This actually doesn't even look like it was burned. This area burned in the 2001 Star Fire in the Sierra Nevada. It's a mixed conifer forest, mature forest, and the fire just crept along the forest floor on the surface and consumed some pine needles and twigs and killed some sapling-sized trees, but that's about it. What a lot of people don't realize is that a large portion, often the majority, of even the largest forest fires look just like this. And people don't realize that because after the fire passes, they drive through or they hike through, and unless you're looking closely, you don't even realize the fire occurred. There's just a little bit of char on the bottom few inches or bottom foot or two of the trees. But after that, you really can't even, it's hard to notice. And so in some of the biggest fires out there, the rim fire, for example, 58% of the rim fire is low intensity. Next slide, please. And what we know now historically from lots of different data sets, from historical evidence, from early settlers, from reconstruction studies, lots of different evidence, we know that fires historically were a real mix of low, moderate, and high intensity. High intensity is basically where fire burns hot. It's what we call crown fire. The fire gets up into the tops of the trees and kills most or all the trees. And it's that type of fire is really what I focus my research on, because that's where what people misunderstand the most. That's what they are afraid of the most, and think that must be the area where fire really does destroy the forest. But then again, we know that fire's been doing this for a long time. There's lots of evidence. Long before fire suppression or logging, fire was operating in this mix. These red areas are high intensity fire patches. The green is mixed and the blue is low. So it was always a mix. And this is in mixed conifer and ponderosa pine forest. In the higher elevation forests, it was even more toward moderate and high intensity. Next slide, please. So one of the big misconceptions out there is that historically our forests were all open and park-like. We've heard that a lot, right? That they were all very, very open and park-like. And now, because of fire suppression, they're overly dense, they're overstocked, we have to get in there and log our forests to restore them back to health. That's what we're hearing from some land management agencies and from the logging industry, and certainly from the Trump administration and their allies in Congress. They're using that narrative right now to try to promote a rollback on environmental laws and to massively increase logging levels on our national forests. What we have found is that there's a series of studies produced by Forest Service scientists primarily, but also some others, that reported very, very low densities of forests historically. But it turns out that data was incomplete. The data were incomplete. And there were lots of other records out there about different sized trees and larger trees and smaller trees and oak trees that were not included in that evidence. And it turns out that when that's included, and my colleagues and I spent many days and long hours in the National Archives in San Bruno, in the Bay Area, finding these records. And when we pulled it all together, it turns out that the historical forests were 7 times denser in mixed conifer forests and 17 times denser in ponderosa pine forests than reported in these earlier studies, which were incomplete and were just based upon a certain size class of conifer trees, but nothing else. Next slide, please. And it's actually one back. That's it.
Too bad.
Hang on, well, I'm just hitting my cursor because my arrows aren't working.
There we go, thank you. And so the other thing that was missing from these earlier studies is an abundance of evidence from early U.S. Forest Service and U.S. Geological Survey researchers back in the late 1800s and early 1900s about patches of high-intensity fire, where fire killed most or all the trees. So that was omitted from these other studies. So we included that, and what that did to the percentage of historical high-intensity fires, it went from 5% up to 27%. So it was still mostly low and moderate. No question about it, and this is in ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests. In those higher elevation forest types, it was oftentimes mostly high intensity, red fir, for example. But in the mixed conifer forests, the thinking historically was that it was only a small percentage, maybe 5%, maybe 7% that was high intensity. Well, it turns out it was more than that. And that's important because it actually puts current fires much more into perspective, because it turns out that current fires, the next slide please, are actually mostly low and moderate intensity too. They have a significant percentage of high intensity, but it's much higher than 5% in almost every fire. And because for so long people thought it was just 5% historically, then if you get a fire where it's 15% or 25% high intensity, they'd say, oh, it's a catastrophic wildfire, it's unnatural. Turns out that's really not true. And this is another key thing that is really important to understand, which is the fire deficit. People don't realize that we actually have less fire in our forests now than we had historically. Less fire, in general, in the western United States, and actually in the east too, now than we had historically. Now, since the mid-1990s, late 1990s, fire has gone up, and it's incrementally increasing. And part of that is a result of increasing temperatures from climate change. But what's interesting is that we still have a lot less fire now than we had in the early 20th century and even before that in the late 1800s, naturally before fire suppression. So we do not have an excess of fire in our forests, we actually have a deficit of all intensities. And that's important to understand, because what it means is we don't need to be as concerned about fire out there in the wildlands. We need to really be concerned about what fire is doing in communities. And we need to focus our attention on making sure that homes are protected. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of our local fires. This is a lake fire, 2015. It burned 3 years ago. Again, the majority of the fire areas is low and moderate intensity. This is a lower intensity area, and there's some moderate intensity in the background. But there are also significant patches of high intensity there, and some of them are fairly large, some are very small, and some are hundreds, and even the biggest one's about 1,500 acres in size. Next slide, please. And we had that too historically. We had patches that were small, and we had patches that were large, so that's not unprecedented. This is in the Fish Creek drainage in the lake fire. We took this picture just over the summer, I believe. And this is in a moderate intensity fire area as we're moving up the drainage. Next slide, please. And still in moderate intensity, or low to moderate. Next slide. And now we're in high intensity. And this is at 3 years post-fire. This is the aspen grove in Fish Creek. And it's just remarkable in just 3 years, the level and extent of regeneration. And aspen is one of these many plant and animal species that really has a strong positive relationship, not just with fire, but with high intensity fire. Aspen needs intense fire to kill the overstory conifers, which grow much taller than the aspen, and they shade out the aspen. That aspen grove is starting to die back before the fire occurred. And what the fire's done is it's given it a whole new lease on life. Now there's far more aspen stems per acre than there were before the fire. Next slide. And just for perspective, that's me. And so you can see it's growing very, very prolifically. I mean, I would say, within another 5 years, it's going to be most of its pre-fire height. I would say it's going to be pretty close. I mean, that's just 3 years. In 5 years, it's going to be at least up to here.
Are they crowning from their
Growing remarkably.
original roots, or are they
So aspen, the organism is below the ground. It's every stem you see, it's not different trees. It's the same organism. And basically, what intense fire does, it stimulates all these shoots to come up and grow very, very rapidly. That's their niche. Their niche is to grow when there's a lot of sunlight after intense fire for the first several decades, before the conifers grow in and begin to overtop them. And then they start to die back because there's too much shade, and another couple hundred years go by and you get another fire. Next slide, please.
Do they need fire to germinate? I know there are plants that do.
Well, they basically, it stimulates the shoots to come up through the ground. But they can also go through sexual reproduction after fire, and it takes intense fire to do that. So you can actually get some new mixing of the genes after fire as well. This is also the Fish Creek drainage, but this is below the aspen grove. This is an area of lupin and bumblebee penstemon and cow parsnip willow. And this is, again, 3 years post-fire in this high-intensity fire patch. This is a large high-intensity fire patch. And this area is just tremendous habitat for dozens of shrub nesting birds and small mammals. And of course, at the peak of bird nesting season, it's just amazing to go in there in the morning and just hear all the birds and see them. Next slide, please. And this is just for perspective. When Rachel and I went out just about a month or so after the fire occurred in 2015, the aspen were already starting to grow. They were already growing. But of course now, 3 years later, it's just dramatically different. And in another 3 years, it's going to be dramatically different still. So things start happening pretty quickly after fire. Next slide, please. And this is the Butler 2 slide. That's the Butler 2 slide fire of 2007. Also, on this forest, not too far away. And this is a place where one of the fires where I've been doing research on post-fire conifer regeneration. And what's interesting is if you just kind of hike through or you drive through, you won't see it because the shrubs get to a certain height. These are all native shrubs, and the conifers grow right through the shrubs. And at a certain point, they get taller than the shrubs, and they just keep going. The shrubs only, they kind of get about maximum height, about this tall, and the conifers keep going. But until they kind of peak up above the shrubs, you can't really see them until you hike through. So when I do my conifer regeneration surveys, I actually go and do plots and pull apart the branches and look for the conifer seedlings. A lot of the assumption is that if you have high levels of shrub cover like this, it will prohibit conifers from growing in. And what I'm finding, and other researchers are finding the same thing, is that's not true at all. In fact, it may be that the conifers actually provide protection for the growing, the shrubs provide protection for the growing conifer seedlings and saplings from herbivory, from deer. They also provide the right mix of sun and shade that help the conifers grow. They don't necessarily want to grow in just complete sunlight. They often kind of get stressed that way. Next slide, please. Again, just one example, just growing right through the shrub cover. This is very common. Next slide. And these shrubs, by the way, this is whitethorn. This is a species of Ceanothus. It's a nitrogen fixer. It takes nitrogen out of the air, puts it into the soil. It enhances soil productivity. These are some that are growing faster and taller out of the shrub cover. These are all from the Butler 2 fire. Next slide. And again, this is a large high-intensity fire patch, and that's all natural regeneration at 10 years post-fire. That was last year. This is from the Grass Valley fire that occurred 2007, thank you. And this is not too far away. Right now, the Forest Service is making the assumption that any patches that burn at high intensity are deforested and have no potential for natural conifer regeneration. And we just did a field trip with them out there, joined by Carla, and walked through these areas, and they had to acknowledge that there's abundant natural conifer regeneration in these areas, and they had actually never done surveys, it turns out. They just made that assumption. Next slide.
I just have to ask that.
They're proposing to replant these areas, by the way.
That's what I,
They're proposing to cut down these areas, remove the shrubs, remove the fire-killed trees, and then artificially plant trees. But of course, if they do that, it will kill the conifers because it's all ground-based machinery. It'll pulverize the conifers. Next slide.
I'm sorry to interrupt, just because that's local and a kind of a concern here. Are they planning on planting the conifers back after they've cleared it?
They are.
The very same trees that you're
Yes.
saying that they were able to identify?
Yes, and I asked them about this, and I said, don't you see a problem? You're saying that these areas were deforested and there's no conifer regeneration, but as you can see, it's all around us, and anywhere we hike, you can see it. And they had to acknowledge that, and they said, well, tell you what, when we're out here we find areas with conifer regeneration, then we may not plant. And I said, well, here's the problem.
If you're messed.
Before you plant, what you're proposing to do is go in with heavy ground-based machinery and remove the shrubs and remove most of the snags, the dead trees, and the down logs. And if you do that, all the science shows that it will kill nearly all of the natural conifer regeneration. It'll actually grind it up underneath the tread of the tractors. And then you'll say, oh look, there's no conifer regeneration, we need to plant. But in many cases there would have been 200, 300 per acre beforehand. So we're asking them to rethink it. They have not been willing to, so we have to have that conversation.
Protest time.
The supervisor, as we
Amazing.
met with the supervisor, Sarah Noron, and actually went down and met with the Sierra Club and John Muir Project filed an objection, and we asked them to focus the resources of the project on helping the homeowners adjacent to that area, help them make their homes fire safe. Because right now, none of the resources in the project are being used for that. And in an area where so many homes were lost not long ago, in that fire, we think that it's the only thing that makes sense, and the science is really good on this. And I'll talk about this more in a little bit, that if you focus on homes, the vast majority of homes will survive a wildland fire. And the Forest Service itself looked at this question, and they said, look, in the Grass Valley fire, the homes that burned, the great majority of them never came in contact with the flames. They burned from embers floating along. And the ones that did come in contact, that's right, the wind-borne embers. And the ones that did come in contact with the flames and burned down, most of those were not from intense crown fire. It was creeping surface fire. It crept right up to the wall of the house and burned the house down. So this whole idea about that somehow logging out in the forest, doing this post-fire logging project, hundreds of feet, hundreds of meters, miles in some cases from the homes, that's somehow going to protect homes. It's just contrary to all the science. And we're asking them to rethink it. So far they've not been willing to, but we'll see.
Thank you, I diverted you there.
No, that's okay. It's an important issue, and I know it's local, and we can follow up on that in Q&A too.
Yeah,
Next slide, please. Of course, there's also an abundance of wildflowers in these fire areas, especially in the high-intensity fire patches. That is where you get the most proliferation of wildflowers. Some of these plants are fire followers. They've evolved to really germinate after intense fire in particular. And so sometimes in places you'll see flowering plants that really haven't been seen in that area for decades. It's remarkable. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about spotted owls, because it's another really locally important thing. A lot of people in the greater, in Southern California don't realize that we have spotted owls in these mountains, but we do. And there's actually a significant population in the San Bernardino Mountains. And so we've been doing research on this because the assumption for such a long time is that fire is categorically a threat to spotted owls. And what the logging industry and the Forest Service have been proposing is to do a lot more logging, supposedly to reduce fire and save the spotted owl from fire. They kind of pitch it like a bitter pill. Yes, it will degrade habitat, but it's the lesser of two evils. What we're finding is that it's a lot of our previously held assumptions are not true. Next slide. This is, these are two young spotted owls, babies, in the lake fire. And I'll talk about this pair because I think it's a perfect way to talk about this thing this concept, the bed and breakfast effect that I'll be talking about. This was a family of spotted owls that was living just west of where the lake fire occurred. When the fire occurred, it burned east, away from their nest tree, and it kept burning east. And so their territory, their nest tree, was not in the fire area. It was about a little over a quarter mile west of the fire perimeter. After the fire, the year after the fire, the first spring, they left their nest site that they had been occupying for years, and they flew into the fire area, and they set up a new nest site, found a new nest tree, in a moderate intensity burn area right on the edge of a large high intensity fire patch, right at that transition point. And they have been successfully reproducing ever since. So the question is, why is that? Why would they do that? Next slide, please. There they are again. Looking down, it just gives you a perspective on them. Next slide. Okay, so now this is the same nest site in the lake fire, but looking just a little bit the other direction. And now you can see this is the high intensity fire patch. So the nest is right over here, and this is one of the adults. And it turns out that the reason they do this is because they really prefer more lightly to moderately burned forest for nesting and roosting. It creates a microclimate. It has important aspects for them. It possibly prevents or protects them against predation from some of the larger, more aggressive raptors, like great horned owls, for example. But they go out of their way to forage, to hunt in these areas of high intensity fire. It's because of the small mammals. This is where the small mammal prey base is the highest. In fact, what scientists have found is that the small mammal prey biomass is 2 to 6 times higher in this habitat type than it is in the more lightly burned areas where it's mostly live trees. And so we call this the bed and breakfast effect because the bed, of course, is the nesting and roosting habitat where it's mostly green trees, some dead trees, but mostly green. And the breakfast is this area of high intensity fire where they get so much food. We call this snag forest habitat. That's the term we use for this unique habitat type that's created by natural disturbance processes that kill patches of trees. Next slide, please. And here's another shot just to give you perspective. That's the nest tree right there. And you can kind of see, this is where it's transitioning from high intensity into moderate intensity over there. So they locate the nest right on the edge. And this is common. Next slide. So this is what it looks like at 12 years post-fire. This is common. This is in the Sierra Nevada, actually. But this is pretty typical for a lot of areas that are a little bit wetter. This is wetter than most of the forests in the San Bernardino National Forest, but and so things grow a little bit faster. But it's pretty representative. You get standing dead trees, which we call snags. Lots of regeneration of conifers and willow, oak, shrub cover, and then down logs. And that mix is great habitat for dozens and dozens of wildlife species. And in fact, many wildlife species have evolved to depend on this habitat type. And you find them in this habitat more than any other habitat type. And in fact, many are so dependent on it that they can't maintain viable populations outside of this habitat. Next slide. One of those is the blackback woodpecker. Blackback woodpecker does not live on this forest. It's a species I've been studying for about 15 years. But a evolutionary cousin, so to speak, does, which is the hairy woodpecker and also the white-headed woodpecker, both the same genus, Picoides, and have similar habitat requirements. They are found that have a lot of fire-killed trees, especially moderate and high-intensity fire areas. And so the question is, why is that? So here's the way this works. When a fire occurs, in the patches where it burns more intensely and gets up into the crown and kills most or all the trees, those areas are incredibly important habitat for dozens of native beetle species called woodborne beetles. And these beetles have evolved receptors in their bodies to detect fire by heat or by smoke, depending on the species, from miles and miles away, sometimes dozens of miles. and they will make a beeline for these fire areas. They fly, and they're really good flyers. Big beetles, sometimes this long. And they fly and they land on the charred bark of a fire-killed tree, not long after it's cooled, and they lay their eggs. And the larvae develop and they bore through the bark into the wood, deep into the wood of a fire-killed tree. And they develop there over the course of a year or 2 years, sometimes 3 or 4 years, depending on the species and conditions. And they emerge then as an adult, and then fly away in the summer, finding the next fire. When they're a larva, when they're in the fire-killed trees, that is the primary food source for hairy woodpeckers and white-headed woodpeckers, and of course blackback woodpeckers in the Sierra Nevada and farther north, and a number of other woodpecker species. One woodpecker will eat typically over 10,000 of these wood-boring beetle larvae every single year in order to have enough food to survive. And they're very, very heavily dependent on these larvae. So you need a lot of fire-killed trees to have that much food for the woodpeckers. Next slide, please. This is just an example. All of the species that have this strong relationship with intense fire, you'll notice they're mostly black. Hairy woodpeckers have that little stripe of white on the back. White-headed woodpeckers have the white face, but they're black on back. Blackback woodpeckers are completely black on the back, and it's natural camouflage. So can anyone find the blackback woodpecker in the picture? No. All right, next slide. Okay, this is a female blackback woodpecker. I was standing 30 feet from her when I took this picture, and that's her head and that's her tail. And if they don't move or vocalize, they're basically invisible for all practical purposes, from a predator, from a human perspective. And they don't either. They'll oftentimes just hunker down and wait for you to pass.
How did you find it?
Well, I've been studying for a long time. I know what I'm looking for, but they're tough. They're really hard. Next slide. And so here's what they do. And this is not just blackback woodpeckers. Hairy woodpeckers and white-headed woodpeckers do the same thing. The fire-killed trees are important not just as a food source, but also for a nesting habitat, because the dead trees are softer than live trees. And that makes them incredibly important. So woodpeckers can excavate nest cavities in these dead trees. Whether they're killed by fire or by drought, dead trees are softer, and they have all that food. So the woodpeckers will create multiple nest cavities. These are monogamous species. And what happens is the male will create every spring. The male will create between 2 and 4 new nest cavities every single spring, even when they stay in the same territory for several years, but they create new nest cavities. So he creates between 2 and 4. The female picks the one she likes the best, and that's where they raise their young that year. And so all of the cavities that he creates each year that they don't use, and the ones from the previous year, those are all available for all the other cavity nesting species in the forest to use, to raise their young. And these are species that need cavities to reproduce, but can't create their own, like bluebirds, and nuthatches, and wrens, mammals, flying squirrels, and chipmunks. On and on and on. Dozens and dozens of bird and small mammal species need these cavities. So if you don't have fire, patches of intense fire that kill trees, or pockets of dead trees from drought and native bark beetles, which is another way you can create this snag forest habitat. If you don't have natural processes creating patches of dead trees, you don't have the beetles. If you don't have the beetles, you don't have the woodpeckers. If you don't have the woodpeckers, you don't have the secondary cavity nesters. There go your bluebirds. There go your nuthatches, your flying squirrels. And if you don't have those, you don't have food for raptors like Cooper's hawks and owls, right? So it turns out this is a very, very rich and interconnected habitat type. And what we're learning is that to have an ecologically healthy forest, to have the full range of biodiversity, you have to have dead trees. And you have to have an abundance of them. In some places, fewer, where it's mostly live trees, because there are different species that like that and prefer that. You want that to be part of the mix. But in some places, you want there to be mostly or entirely dead trees. Next slide, please. And of course, the other aspect is the natural regeneration of the forest that is stimulated by fire and by other natural disturbance processes. the extra sunlight that's coming through when trees are killed stimulates growth of flowering shrubs and lots of wildflowers, and that attracts native flying insects. And so you get this enormous abundance and diversity of flying insects attracted to all the understory vegetation growing in, many of which is flowering plants. And that provides food for fly-catching birds and bats. And so they have more food. Next slide, please. And many of these are shrub nesting birds as well. So some of them nest in the cavities, and some of them nest in the shrubs on the ground, in that whitethorn, or in the deer brush, or in other shrubs. And many of these species that depend on snag forest habitat have evolved to depend on either the shrub component or the snag component. Depends on the species. A lot of the wood warblers, for example, really like those shrubs, and you find them mostly in these high-intensity fire patches. But because of fire suppression, because of post-fire logging practices on national forests and private lands, many of these wildlife species, including a lot of the bird species that depend on snag forest habitat, have become rare, and many of them are declining. And that's something that we need to reverse. We don't want too much fire, but we also don't want too little. And contrary to widespread perceptions, right now we actually have too little in our forests. And this forest is closer to historical norms than most forests in the West. And that's actually a good thing. We don't want it to go too high, but we also don't want to go too low. So the point is this, is that when we see fires burning, our focus should really be, as long as we don't have too much fire, our focus should really be on protecting homes and on making sure homes are protected. Next slide.
Rather than putting out the fire.
Exactly, rather than trying to stop weather-driven backcountry fires that you can't stop until the weather changes anyway. You can't. I mean, fires are weather-driven, and you really can't stop a weather-driven wildland fire any more than you can stand on a ridge and fight the wind. And this is why the fires keep going, and then we spend more resources, and there's another 500 people come in, another $10 million spent trying to stop the fire, and 3 or 4 weeks goes by, bless you. And the fire doesn't stop, and then all of a sudden the temperature drops 12 degrees and the relative humidity goes up and the wind dies down and you get a little bit of late summer rain, and all of a sudden the fire slows and stops and everyone says, yay, we put out the fire. But we didn't put out the fire, nature put out the fire. That's the way this works. So the one place where fire suppression has had such an impact and continues to is in lightning strikes that are away from homes and communities, where it's low fire weather. It's kind of cool conditions, maybe it's kind of early season, there's still a lot of moisture, and you've got this ignition, it's just barely creeping along. I mean, a lot of these lightning strikes, in the early season, they'll just barely move, just a fraction of an acre. For weeks they'll go by, and it may get to a couple of acres, if that. And then, naturally, if it's not suppressed, the temperatures go up, the humidity goes down, the wind kicks up, now you've got fire weather conditions, and then it starts spreading faster, and then you get mixed intensity fire, and you get some of those crown fire patches that the woodpeckers love, and all these other species. That can't happen if that fire is put out when it's just a fraction of an acre and it's barely moving. That's when they can be put out, when it's very low fire weather. And that's when 97% of lightning strikes that cause ignitions are actually put out when they're barely moving. So we need to rethink that. If it's close to a town, that's different. That's human safety. But if it's out farther in the forest, we need to let those burn. Again, I talked about small mammals for the bed and breakfast effect, or things like spotted owls. Also species like Pacific fisher. I've done a lot of research on Pacific fishers, which is like a small wolverine. They're very rare, highly imperiled mammal, and there's an isolated population in the southern Sierra Nevada. Same assumption was made for years, that fire is the biggest threat. They were doing all these logging projects supposedly to save the fisher, knowing that the fishers avoid logged areas. But no one, it made so much sense to everyone that they didn't bother to test the assumption. So I was the first person to go out and actually test it. We used scat detecting dogs to look at the frequency of fisher scat in different areas, fire areas, unburned. And what I found is that they're just like spotted owls, it's bed and breakfast effect. They are very actively foraging in these large high intensity fire patches, if they're not logged. Next slide, please. Black bears, mule deer, also love the snag forest habitat. There's lots of food. There's small mammals, there's berries, there's grubs, there's just lots of very nutrient-rich foliage. Interestingly, for the mule deer, the same species of plants the plants that grow in after intense fire, because of all the nutrient cycling, they actually are more nutrient rich. So ounce for ounce, pound for pound, the deer get better food from those leaves, even of the same plants, in areas that burn. So they really like these fire areas. Next slide, please. Now, this is interesting, and this is counterintuitive, but as fire intensity goes up, the 3 there, that basically is 100% tree mortality. That's that patch of snag forest habitat. Anything above 2 is that snag forest habitat. That's actually where your highest total bird abundance is. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean you don't want low intensity fire or moderate. You do, because there are whole groups of species also that select these areas as well. You want the mosaic, you want the mix. And that's exactly what we're getting, actually, in our fires. Next slide, please. In the Sierra Nevada, they found that 25 years post-fire in the high-intensity fire patches, the snag forest habitat, 40% more bird species, so species richness was higher than in the adjacent unburned old forest. Unburned old forest, incredibly important, but again, on balance, what most studies are finding now is that the 2 most important forest types are old-growth forest and snag forest habitat. And snag forest habitat is actually comparable to old-growth forest in terms of native biodiversity and wildlife abundance. And in many data sets, it's actually higher, depends on the study. But the point is this is an ecologically rich habitat type. Next slide, please. So again, biodiversity and wildlife abundance comparable to old-growth forest in these areas with just 100% or 90 to 100% dead trees that people thought for so long was destroyed or damaged. A loss of forest is the way people think of it. It's actually not the loss of habitat, it's the creation of wildlife habitat. It's rarer than old-growth forest, and it has almost no protections under current forest plans or statutes or regulations, almost no protections. And rarer now than it was historically because of the fire deficit. Next slide.
What is seral forest?
Seral is basically, seral's another way, we probably shouldn't even use the word seral because no one knows what it means. But basically it's another word for successional. So early seral forest is like early successional forest. That's another term. This is the scientific term for snag forest habitat is complex early seral forest. But I don't use that term very often. I use it when I'm talking to scientists, but otherwise, we use the term snag forest habitat. Thank you. Yeah, do you have a question?
Well, I'm not understanding snag forest, that's a term I'm not quite getting.
Yeah, it's basically these areas where intense fire occurs and kills most or all the trees.
Snag.
Those are that patch. And a snag is a standing dead tree, so we call it snag forest habitat. But it's not just the snags, it's also the understory vegetation too. And so we actually, in 2014, my colleagues and I published the very first paper that officially described this as a unique habitat type that has a unique plant-animal community associated with it, and recommended a conservation and monitoring strategy for snag forest habitat, and so and for complex early seral forest. So we coined that term in 2014, and it's now recognized as a unique forest habitat type. But it always has been for millions of years. This is a study I published earlier this year with a couple of colleagues, spotted owl biologists, and we looked at different fire areas in the Sierra Nevada and also in the San Bernardino Mountains. And what we wanted to find out was, what is the effect of post-fire logging on spotted owls? Because some of the earlier research was showing that spotted owls were foraging, the radio telemetry studies, they were foraging in these high-intensity fire patches. In fact, they were going out of their way to forage in them. So if that's the case, then logically it would seem that if you take that habitat away, it might adversely impact them. So we looked at that. Next slide, please. And we found that the adverse impact was quite massive, actually. That even what seems like, from a human perspective, a relatively small amount, even down to 5% post-fire logging of that habitat in their territory, there's a huge overall reduction in occupancy. The average level of post-fire logging was 16%, and this is the effect it had on occupancy. Where there was
the post-fire logging, is there a commercial attribute to that? I mean,
yes.
So there's a commercial incentive.
The Forest Service sells dead trees, whether they're killed by fire or killed by drought and native bark beetles, and the bark beetles are native too. when trees are killed by natural processes, the Forest Service sells public trees to private logging companies and keeps the revenue. Now, when it comes to what they call salvage logging, and I don't use that term because it's not a scientific term, it's not an ecological term. But from their perspective, they're salvaging some economic benefit from it. And it comes from this historical impression that dead trees don't contribute anything positive, and therefore the best you can do is get something economic out of them. We know now that's not true, but the way the policy, the way the law is set up, it's called the Salvage Sale Fund Act. It was set up decades ago, and it allows the Forest Service to keep 100% of the revenue from selling public trees to private logging companies. So instead of going to the general fund of the US Treasury, it doesn't do that. It goes right back to the Forest Service. In fact, it's earmarked for the forest that made the timber sale. And the staff actually directly get that money. So it provides, it creates a powerful perverse incentive.
Yes.
And we believe, the John Muir Project believes, and the Sierra Club believes, and many other organizations, that we should be managing our national forests more like national parks. That the Forest Service should not be in the commercial logging business. Because honestly, there's a lot of good people in the Forest Service. There are. But the way the laws are set up, it puts good people in a position where they feel compelled and oftentimes forced to behave badly in terms of environmental laws and habitat impacts. So this is just one example. The effect of post-fire logging on spotted owls is quite severe. Next slide, please.
What do you think is the cause of this? Is it the disturbance of the land?
The cause of this is the removal of their key foraging grounds, their hunting grounds. Because when the snags are removed, when the shrubs are removed, which is what happens in post-fire logging, I mean, typically they'll leave 2 or 3 or 4, sometimes 6 snags per acre. But that's about 90 to 95% removal. It's basically a clear cut. And when that happens, essentially everything good about snag forest habitat for wildlife, everything good about snag forest habitat for small mammals that the spotted owls need for their food, that disappears. And so you have essentially 0 habitat value afterwards, or pretty close to it. Next slide. And I'll show you some pictures in just a minute about that. Now here's an interesting, when there was no post-fire logging, it didn't matter whether the spotted owl territory had 25 to 49% high-intensity fire or 50 to 80% high-intensity fire. They had the same levels of occupancy, which is actually quite high. So even when most of a territory burns at high intensity, there's still very high occupancy, and it's comparable to the same level of occupancy as it is when you have lower levels of high intensity fire. And in fact, reproduction goes up when you have more high intensity fire because there's more food. The big factor here is post-fire logging, and people assume that wasn't the case in the past because sometimes it's like, well, 10%, 15% gets post-fire logged of a territory, and they think, well, that's so small, it couldn't possibly make a difference. Turns out it does. Next slide, please.
They probably don't believe it.
Well, we have good data on this, and interestingly, the Forest Service did its own research on this independently after our stuff came out, and they found very similar results. And they've been ignoring that ever since, but we keep reminding them. So yeah, again, reproduction goes way down if there's post-fire logging, occupancy goes down. If there is no post-fire logging, occupancy is comparable and reproduction goes up. Next slide, please. I just wanted to illustrate this. This is the rim fire of 2013. It occurred 5 years ago in the Sierra Nevada. 257,000 acre fire, big fire. I've been doing research in there every summer ever since. On any given year, I've got 3 or 4, sometimes 5 studies going on in the rim fire. And it's interesting because it's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Even today, in the biggest fires driven by the most intense fire weather, it's mostly low and moderate intensity fire effects. These light green, dark green, and yellow areas. The light green, dark green are low intensity, the yellow is moderate, where you get a lot of live trees, but a lot of dead trees too. The green, the light green and dark green, it's almost entirely live trees. Most of this fire is the green and yellow. And visually speaking, red jumps out at you. So if it's 10% of the fire, visually you'll think it's 25%. But what this represents, the red is 19.9% of this fire area by the numbers. This is 58% low intensity, and the rest is moderate, whatever 22%, whatever the rest is. but it's mostly low and moderate. So I take journalists out to the rimfire, I take environmentalists on tours, other scientists, and we're driving along and they ask me when we're going to get to the rimfire, and I have to tell them we've been in the rimfire for 25 minutes, we've been driving through it, but they don't realize because it's just all these live trees and it's really not changed from what they think of as an unburned forest, because that's what these green areas look like. It's only not until you get into the moderate, the yellow, that you really start seeing it, but even a lot of those areas, it's hard to tell.
How much are, in terms of acreage, what are we looking at?
Well, the whole fire is 257,000 acres. All right, so most of these high-intensity fire patches are an acre or two, or a fraction of an acre, or a few acres, but there are a few that are big. These are a few. This one here, I think of this as one patch, even there's a little stringer through it. That's a few thousand acres. This is a few thousand acres. Some of this is not forest, so this is mostly grassland and chaparral and some oak woodland. The forested portion is up here, that's a few thousand acres, this one's a few thousand acres. We know historically there were high-intensity fire patches that were that size, some were bigger. And so none of these are unprecedented. And we also know that though this was the biggest fire in the Sierra Nevada since we started keeping records in modern history, which is the late 1930s. This is the biggest fire in the Sierra Nevada. It's not as big as a number of fires that occurred in the 1800s.
So this is a total wildland fire, not close to civilization?
This is in a very remote area. Yeah, there's a portion of this fire right around here. There's a tiny little, I don't know if you want to call it a town, it's kind of a wide spot in the road, but there's a few buildings, there's a restaurant, there's a little lodge called Buck Meadows that's in here. There's a couple of backcountry lodges or camps that have been there for a while. Most of them did quite well, they survived the fire just fine.
No $500,000 homes or...
There's one area in here where there was a cluster of about 4 homes, and I think 2 might have burned in it, but basically it's an incredibly remote area. This is wild country, very wild country, yeah. Next slide, please. And this is what it looks like at 5 years post-fire in the largest high-intensity fire patches in the rimfire. This is snag forest habitat, all this natural regeneration of pines and fir and cedar and pine, fir, cedar, ferns, shrubs, the snags, the down logs. This is incredibly rich habitat. The Forest Service right now is proposing thousands of acres of post-fire clear cutting in this area and in many areas like it in the rimfire on public lands, on the Stanislaus National Forest, funded by a $28 million grant from the Trump administration. Based upon the claim that there's no natural conifer regeneration in these areas. They say they're deforested, and if you have a large high-intensity fire patch where you're hundreds of meters away from the nearest live tree, it's not possible to get natural conifer regeneration. But that's what we're seeing here. And so it's not just about the proximity of live trees. Conifer regeneration is happening because of the birds and the small mammals, and because there's so many birds and small mammals in the snag forest habitat, they're moving seeds all over the place all the time. And you get this incredibly rich regeneration. This has been going on for millions of years. Just for perspective, there's a group of, in my very, very narrow group in my field called, basically they study the earliest origins of evolutionary traits. They're geneticists, essentially. And they decided to figure out when did these earliest initial traits in conifers develop evolutionarily in response to crown fire, like serotinous cones. And what that means is there are certain conifer species that need really intense fire to melt the resins in the cones and release the seeds to reproduce. They depend on intense fire to reproduce. Some of the species on this forest, in fact. They figured out those traits evolved 120 million years ago in the forests of North America. So this isn't something that's been happening for hundreds of years or thousands of years or even millions. This has been happening for tens of millions of years, these processes. And these forests have got this covered. They don't need artificial planting. They don't need to have us come in and cut them down and spray herbicides and plant tree plantations, which is really a crop. It's not a forest. They're naturally regenerating beautifully. What the Trump administration is proposing to do with these areas of snag forest habitat, the rimfire, is clear cut them and then haul these snags and any other vegetation down the hill and incinerate them in biomass plants for kilowatts. Rachel and I call this the Clear Cuts for Kilowatts plan. And this is the first big proposal like this on any national forest anywhere in California, and the biggest by far anywhere in the country. The Trump administration is saying they want to do a lot more of this on national forests, and this is their first big push. So we're fighting that, and we're trying to stop that, and the John Muir Project and Sierra Club, Center for Biological Diversity, lots of organizations, NRDC is joining us as well. Next slide, please. This is what it looks like where they've done what they call restoration. Now, I can't emphasize this enough. This
Is that a
was
local photograph or?
this is also the rimfire. This is the same high intensity fire patch as the previous picture, but this was post fire log 4 years ago. And this is what it still looks like. I took this picture just several months ago. And this is what it looks like. And basically it's bare ground and some slash debris and invasive weeds, which are brought in by a lot of logging equipment and proliferate after logging. This is mostly cheatgrass now. Next slide. Natural regeneration in places where they say there is none. Next slide. And what they call restoration. So this is post-fire logging. Is basically, this is all in the rimfire. Again, in the high intensity fire patches. They cut everything and just stripped it down to bare soil, and they plant tree plantation. And some of these will survive and grow, and many have already died. You can see the places where there are gaps. And, but even, and in fact, in many places they've come in and they've planted again where they've died, and they've done it again and again. And we'll see this, multiple times. They sprayed herbicides before they did this and just killed all the other vegetation. But whatever trees do grow, what they planted, it won't be a forest. It'll be a crop. It'll be, a sterile place that really doesn't support any significant life or biodiversity. Next slide. And this is an area where, as a colleague of mine calls it, she calls it slow fire. This is, a mosaic of effects from drought and native bark beetles. This is the southern Sierra Nevada. This is mixed conifer and ponderosa pine forest. And what's so interesting is that this is an area, and there are many areas just like this. This was mapped as a giant big red area by the Forest Service's aerial mapping. And the way that the Forest Service has been, and a lot of politicians have been representing these areas, is if it's like 20,000 acres of nothing but dead trees. That's a complete myth. It's hard to find anything that's even a half an acre that's 100% dead trees. And even then, if the overstory trees are dead, the small trees are still alive. These are all regenerating already. You've got patches of dead trees that are just teeming with wildlife, and next to areas of live trees. And it's the same kind of mosaic effect that you get from fire. It just doesn't happen as quickly. It happens over the course of a few years. It peaks, and then it sort of subsides. There's very, very little additional mortality in 2018. It's basically this wave of mortality is what I call snag recruitment. It started in 2014, it peaked in 2016, it subsided dramatically in 2017, and now it's basically back to baseline levels. And what you've got after that are these patches of snag forest habitat where you had very little before. You had homogeneous forest before, now you've got heterogeneity. This is going to be great for wildlife habitat if they don't log it. And they are logging some of these areas. We've managed to stop them from logging most of it. Now again, it's a good thing, but you don't want too much. You can have too much of a good thing, right? You don't want everything across the entire landscape to be dead trees. You can have big patches, that's good, as long as you don't have too many big patches. You can have small patches, that's good too. Point is that right now, in the Sierra Nevada, for example, with the recent pulse of snag recruitment from drought and native bark beetles and the fires over the recent decades, only 6 to 8% of the forests of the Sierra Nevada are comprised of snag forest habitat, depending on how broadly or narrowly you define it. 6 to 8%. Historically, at any given point in time, it was between 14 and 30%. So we don't want it to be 50%, but also we shouldn't lament the fact that it's 8%, or if 8% goes up to 12 or 14. That's a good thing.
Chad, in 2003, our forests looked like that.
Yeah.
And the Forest Service was alarmed, and all the fire agencies, that it was going to be much more susceptible to wildfire because of the high tree mortality.
Yeah.
Was that an accurate assumption?
No, it's not, but it's like many assumptions people
I
make.
mean, we did get a fire.
Yeah, oh, sure, sure. It's like many assumptions
It was
people
set.
make. Yeah, it seems intuitively correct,
Yeah.
right? If you have dead trees, they're gonna be fuel, they're gonna burn more intensely, right? Because they're dead, they're dry. In reality, it doesn't work that way. And I was a co-author of the very first scientific study that looked at this question. We looked at it on the San Bernardino National Forest. We published that in 2009, specifically to address that assumption, because at that time, the Forest Service was proposing, and they did some of this, but they were proposing widespread logging projects of these areas,
Right.
supposedly to stop the fires. And they did it in a lot of areas, but a lot of areas, us and other organizations managed to hold them off. What we found is this, is that in the areas that had a lot of pre-fire dead trees, pre-fire snags, they didn't burn any differently than the areas that had almost no pre-fire dead trees. Burned very similar. Now other people, we published the very first study on that, other people came in, other scientists, and they said that can't be right. So they looked at the same thing, they found the same thing. Others came in, looked at the same question, found the same thing. What other studies are finding now, excuse me, is that a lot of these areas are burning less intensely when fire occurs than areas with fewer dead trees. In the first 2 years after trees die, and you've got orange, basically orange reddish needles on the trees, that means this is within 1 to 2 years after the trees die. After that, the needles fall, they turn gray and then they fall. When they fall, they decay into soil very, very quickly. The small twigs fall, they decay into soil very, very quickly. And then what happens is you basically just got a large log standing in the forest, essentially. So, anyone who's ever built a campfire, you don't put a large log on the campfire and put a match to it and expect it to burn. It's not going to burn. What you do is you put kindling there, dry leaves and pine needles and small twigs, and you get that going, and eventually you can get the log burning. But basically, it's like a tree without kindling. And so, in a lot of these areas, especially after the first 2 years, they tend to burn less intensely most of the time, and that's what most of the research is showing now. When we did our research, we looked at it in terms of what the old fire and the Grand Prix fire did, because it was right after that kind of pulse of snag recruitment, and so it was recent mortality. So we were looking at it in what's called the red phase, and we didn't find a difference. Some people have found a slightly increased fire intensity in the red phase, some people have found slightly decreased fire intensity, so the results are kind of equivocal, not huge differences, but some in the red phase, first 2 years. After that, mostly lower.
And the other assumption was they're all dying off because the forest is overstocked, because we've suppressed fires and hasn't naturally thinned. And since we got so many houses in this forest, we're going to have to continually go in and thin the forest mechanically.
Right.
So we don't get this.
It's another assumption, and again, superficially, it makes intuitive sense, right? They think, well, there's so much competition, and the forests are overstocked, and that's why the trees are dying. That's also not consistent with the evidence. What the science is showing is that forest density has shockingly little to do with how many trees die when you get drought conditions. And in fact, it's mostly driven by the bark beetles themselves. Interestingly, and there's a paper that's just published on this, the bark beetles, which are again native beetle species, they actually preferentially select the weakest trees, the trees that are least climate resilient, the ones that are most susceptible to drought and to temperature, the ones that are least able to survive the more extreme conditions. They select those trees, and those are the ones they kill.
So they thin the forest more efficiently than the loggers.
Vastly more. I mean, in fact, there's no comparison, because what the beetles are doing is they're actually creating a more resilient and a more climate resilient forest.
Survival of the fittest.
That's right, it's classic survival of the fittest. And so, when you go in with a chainsaw, you really have no idea what's a more resilient tree, right? The beetles actually know this, and this has actually been worked out genetically. There's a huge genetic difference between the trees that they kill versus the ones that they don't. Next slide, please.
So they shouldn't be cut down even if they're infected?
They should not be cut down unless it could fall on a home,
Yeah.
right? If a dead tree could fall on your house, you got to cut it down. I do the same thing. If it could fall on a power line or it could fall on a campground, you have to cut it down. But once it's cut down, you should leave it on the ground, because down logs are incredibly important habitat for small mammals, for invertebrates, for a lot of species. and it's not a hazard of falling anymore once it's down. But outside of those narrow circumstances, they should be left in the forest because they're incredibly important, and they don't really, it's not this, tinderbox that a lot of politicians keep talking about. And so I just wanted to sort of emphasize this because the other interesting thing we're finding is that the same thing with regard to that bed and breakfast. If you get patches of dead trees that result from drought and native bark beetles, that's where you find the spotted owls. That's where you find their nest core. Next slide.
So the old growth forest, they don't need.
The old growth forests are doing just great, and if some patches of trees get killed by fire, that's great. If patches of trees get killed by drought and native beetles, that's great too. They regenerate, it's great habitat, it's good for owls, it's good for fishers. So you get this is a nest roost core for spotted owls, and I wanted to show this because this is an area that hadn't burned in a long time. But you've got a lot of messiness, right? This is not a clean, structured place. You've got different trees of different sizes. You've got dead trees and pockets of dead trees. You've got down logs. This is great habitat. Next slide. So you don't want something to be, clean and tidy, right? This is just a little bit farther away. This is a patch of snag forest habitat created by drought and native bark beetles. This was created almost certainly during that pulse in the early 2000s. And this is where the spotted owls locate their nest territories, right next to this stuff, because again, bed and breakfast, there's tons of small mammals in these shrubs, these down logs, and these snags. Next slide. But when the Forest Service does these logging projects, what they often euphemistically call thinning, which is really, in most cases, thinning is a pretty intensive commercial logging project, oftentimes killing most of the trees in a stand. When that happens, spotted owl occupancy goes down dramatically, very similar to what happens after post-fire logging. In this circumstance, over 43% of the owls disappeared within 6 years because of mechanical thinning. This was on the Plumas National Forest. Next slide, please. And this is what it looks like. This is pretty intensive stuff. The term thinning, they think of Forest Service folks out there with pruning shears. That's the image it conjures up, right? And the reality is that in the vast majority of cases, it's a pretty intensive commercial logging operation. They'll call it fuel reduction, they'll call it restoration, they'll call it resilience work, they'll call it lots of things. They almost never call it logging. But the reality is, we'll call it forest health. But the reality is, it's pretty intensive. Next slide. And this is another one. You can see what you've got is some widely spaced live mature trees. But that's about all you've got. And a forest, live mature trees is one key component among about 6 that define what a forest ecosystem is. The others are the smaller understory trees, the snags, the down logs, the shrubs, the wildflowers. All of these things make up the forest ecosystem, and different groups of wildlife species depend on different aspects of the habitat in the forest. Most of the biodiversity in the forest does not depend on mature green trees. Some do, but it's just a component. You gotta have the rest to have a healthy forest, and what mechanical thinning does is it removes most of what actually defines a forest. Next slide, please. And this goes to your question. And this is one of the most comprehensive studies. This was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences a few years after our study was published. They looked at this, but they did a much bigger analysis than we did, and they said, sorry, areas that have a lot of dead trees before the fire occurs, they just don't burn more intensely. Fire spread isn't faster in those areas. Next slide. And other researchers are saying, well, that's true, it's not burning faster, but it's burning less intensely. So this just shows with more years after the trees die, this is declining fire intensity in areas that have higher levels of dead trees. And this is another very comprehensive study. So that's really where the debate is. If there's an argument, it's whether it's the same or whether it's lower fire intensity. But based upon the data, these areas are not burning more intensely when they have more dead trees. Next slide, please. Another counterintuitive thing, we believe that, a lot of people believe that fire intensity is going up. Fires are getting more intense. And that's actually not consistent with the evidence. And I've published a number of studies on this too. I have a quote from some colleagues because they looked at the entire western United States. Most of my research is in California forests. But I'm finding the same thing. The vast majority of the scientists who are publishing work on this are finding that fires in our forests are not getting more intense. We are getting more acres burned annually. That is incrementally increasing relative to where things were a few decades ago. We still have a lot less now than we had historically, but it is increasing. So the acres burned are going up incrementally, inching closer every decade, a little bit closer to what's natural, which is not a bad thing. But as that's happening, the assumption that we've had that fires are getting more intense, in other words, that the proportion of a given fire that is high intensity is getting higher. So like that rim fire image that I showed you earlier, that those red areas, that they would spread and it's most of the fire. That's not happening.
Correlated to global warming.
Yeah, so as temperatures are going up, fire overall annual acres burned is increasing. Part of that is due to global warming. But interestingly, fires are not getting more intense. So it turns out there's more complex interactions going on. Some of that might be due to the fact that we're getting more summer precipitation in certain areas, which has a damping effect. Next slide, please. And I'll just talk about this briefly, but it's really important. We know now that in order to effectively mitigate climate change, we have to not only move beyond fossil fuel consumption, which is essential, but we know now it's not sufficient. In order to keep temperatures from rising to catastrophic levels, in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change, we also have to substantially increase forest protection. And this is something that's being recognized. In fact, the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations report, IPCC report, just came out and made essentially the same conclusion, that the best scenario that they modeled was moving beyond fossil fuel consumption, moderate reductions in energy consumption, and increased forest protection and recovery of forests in places where it's been lost long ago to agriculture. That is the way forward in terms of climate change mitigation. And in fact, the Sierra Club's Council of Club Leaders
I'm talking to the resolution.
and the Board of Directors just passed resolutions unanimously, in both cases, recognizing the importance of protecting forests as part of our climate change campaign. So that is now part of the Sierra Club's work on climate change mitigation. It is not just moving beyond fossil fuel consumption, which we're going to continue to push because that's essential, but also incorporating forest protection as part of it. Next slide, please.
I'll just expand that just a little bit, because the resolution came forward through the Council of Leaders. In several discussions, we actually expanded that concern for climate, attacking climate change, to recognize many natural ecosystems that create carbon sequestration, such as, and the ones that I learned while I was there, I was fighting for deserts, because our chapter has a particular concern about the desert sequestration. But soils, marshlands, and what was it, grasslands in the Midwest.
So actually, Steve and I worked on this together in the final language at the Council of Club Leaders just before the board resolution, including some of the other ecosystems. So it actually reads forests and other ecosystem types. We mentioned deserts, grasslands, wetlands is a big one. We focus on forests because from a carbon storage per acre standpoint, nothing can quite compare to forests. So that's the big ticket item, but these other ecosystem types are important too. And what it really tells us is that we've had these things in different boxes in our minds. Wildlands protection, deserts, and by the way, when I first started off as a Sierra Club activist, I was working on the California Desert Protection Act. So I started off as a desert activist, and I love the desert. I'm a desert lover and a forest lover, very much. But that protecting wildland, wild places, protecting habitat is not in a different box from climate change mitigation. These are really part of the same thing. Yeah, I'm sorry, there's a question back there.
I've heard about some studies that basically said that with increased temperature, some of the plants will actually take 30% less carbon than they do with the normal range of temperatures as now. Can you comment on that?
Well, there's a lot of research that's projecting different things in terms of the future. There are other studies that are saying the opposite. They're saying, well, with increased CO2, you're actually going to get increased growth rates because Plants pull in, breathe in CO2, and use that to add biomass. So I think the reality is it's going to be a little bit different depending upon ecosystem. You're not going to see everything happen exactly the same way every place. But the bottom line is this, is that when it comes to our forests in particular, but also other ecosystem types, grasslands, wetlands, deserts, there are a lot of places where past development, past logging or other development has removed the biomass, has disturbed the soils. If those areas are protected, those areas will naturally recover. They will rewild, essentially. And that rewilding process will pull massive amounts of CO2 out of the atmosphere, and we need that. Next slide, please. A lot of folks don't realize this, that when logging happens, you'll hear the logging industry say, well we're going to store the carbon in 2x4s, right, in lumber products. Here's the reality, and there's lots of research on this, is that most of the carbon in trees that are logged ends up as CO2 emissions relatively immediately from the manufacturing process and also from the logging process itself, such as burning of slash debris in the forest. And when forests are protected, then basically it's pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. Next slide, please. Oops. You can actually just do a series of these and I'll just sort of talk
I was
about it.
writing and I wasn't looking
No,
to
that's
see what I
okay.
was doing here.
There we go, that's good, that's good. So basically, logging is a huge source of CO2 emissions. It's second to fossil fuel consumption. But interestingly, in terms of climate change mitigation, forest protection is a really big percentage of the solution. As high as 50%, some estimates in some of the studies that are published. We can't get what we need to get to in climate change mitigation without protecting forests in addition to moving beyond fossil fuel consumption. People think that the biggest problem is in Brazil or it's in Siberia in terms of logging. We think it's over there, overseas somewhere. Actually, the most logging happens in the US than any other country in the world. We need to change here, and we need to encourage other countries to change too, absolutely, to increase their forest protection. We need to incentivize that, do everything we can. At the same time, in order to have credibility as an international player and not be called hypocrites, we need to take those steps here. I believe that protecting national forests from logging and ending the logging program on national forests is a key step toward that. We also need greater protections on private lands. But if we ended logging on national forests, it's like taking 13 to 24 million cars off the road. It's a big part of the solution. Next slide, please. And here's another one, just kind of debunking another myth. We hear a lot about, we've seen politicians sort of foaming at the mouth talking about catastrophic wildfires and pro-logging politicians talking about rolling back environmental laws and increasing logging supposedly to stop these fires. And one of the arguments they've used is that when big fires occur, the forests are vaporized. The trees go poof, all that carbon goes into the atmosphere. And the reality is that only about, even in a big fire, even a big intense fire like the Rim Fire or like the Biscuit Fire that happened in 2002, only about 10% of the carbon in the forest is actually consumed. And most of that is from the duff and litter on the forest floor. Of the actual above ground carbon in the trees, even in a crown fire, it's typically only about 3% of the carbon is consumed. 3%. So we've heard a lot, we've heard some of the politicians say, well, the Rim Fire, it emitted 12 million tons of CO2. And it's equivalent to 2.3 million cars and all these things, and they put these messages out there. I've looked at every single one of those. These are modeling exercises, bless you, that are based on the assumption that trees are vaporized. Basically 100% of the carbon in the trees is vaporized and goes in the atmosphere when fires burn, and that the forest doesn't regenerate. Neither of those is true. In reality, it's not 100% of the carbon that goes in the atmosphere. It's about 1% or less in low-intensity fire area, and it's about 3% or less of the tree carbon. So again, counterintuitive, it's different from what we believe, but we live in an area where you see forest fires, and we can walk through areas where fires occurred, including intense fire patches. And you don't see big holes in the ground where the tree used to be, you see standing snags. Next slide. So, what does it all mean in the big picture? Because we don't have too much fire in our forests, because the patches that do burn intensely are incredibly important wildlife habitat because they regenerate. Because fire is actually a rejuvenating force in our forests, as long as we don't have too much, and we don't have too much right now, we have too little, our focus needs to be on protecting homes, protecting communities. We know now from multiple studies that if we focus on homes, if we help homeowners take basic steps to make the homes themselves more fire safe, fire-resistant roofing, rain gutter guards to keep the pine needles and leaves from accumulating in the rain gutters, where an ember can land and ignite, exterior vents to prevent the embers from, vent covers to prevent the embers from floating into an attic space, basic steps like that, combined with defensible space within 100 feet of the home. And the first 50 feet out from the house is the most important. When that's done, over 90% of homes, conservatively, over 90% of homes will survive a wildland fire. We know it's effective. And in many cases, we've got case studies where over 99% of homes are surviving wildland fires when this is done properly. And just to be clear, when I talk about defensible space, I'm not talking about cutting all the trees next to the home. You don't need to do that. In fact, it's not a good idea. You want to leave the mature trees. You want to cut most of the really small trees and the shrubs and the grasses. You want to rake up pine needles and small twigs, especially in that first 40 or 50 feet next to the home. But the mature trees, just limb them up. Remove the lower limbs up to about 6, 7 feet from the ground. You don't want to remove all the vegetation. You just want to break up the continuity of it. And when that's done effectively, the vast majority of homes will survive a fire. Beyond 100 feet from the home, what you do in terms of vegetation management or removal has no additive effect or benefit in home protection. So anything that's happening beyond 100 feet from the homes is just unnecessarily damaging habitat, it's unnecessarily diverting resources away from home protection. And it's giving homeowners a false sense of security, thinking that that fuel reduction project, so-called, up on the ridge or over the ridge, is going to save my home from wildland fire. These logging projects don't stop fire. In many cases, they make them burn more intensely. We published the most comprehensive study on that a year and a half ago, 2 years ago actually. Bradley et al. 2016, I was a co-author of that, and what we found is we're 3 decades of data, millions and millions of acres of fires. We analyzed it, and we found that the forests with the fewest environmental protections and the most logging, they actually burn more intensely. The forests with the most environmental protections and the least logging burn least intensely. And the least intense of all are the forests that are completely protected and have no history of logging at all. So, bottom line is we're not going to log our way to get rid of fire, and nor should we even try to get rid of fire. But we can protect homes from wildland fire, and we can do a very, very good job of that if we focus our resources there. Right now, the push is to double down on backcountry fire suppression and logging projects under the Trump administration, but that's not consistent with the science. I do believe we'll turn the corner on this, and we'll get the focus back on homes, but it's going to take some work. Thank you.
Has there been any?
Actually, would you mind one more advance? This is just for people who want more information. My colleagues and I came out with a book. I'm the co-editor and co-author of this. The Ecological Importance of Mixed Severity Fires, Nature's Phoenix. It's available on Amazon. We have a bunch of chapters about the ecology and fire history. We also have an entire chapter at the end devoted entirely to how to live, safely coexist with fire, how to protect your home from wildland fire, and all the different steps and tips on that. You can also visit the John Muir Project's website. We have all kinds of information, lots of pictures, studies you can download there. But yeah, we can go back to Q&A. I just want to make sure to mention that.